Hello there. The latest quarterly outlook for manufacturing for Q4 has just been released by Make UK with BDO, and it offers quite a mixed picture for the sector in the coming year. I'm joined by James Broom, who's senior economist at Make UK. James, what's your main takeaway from this report?
I think in general, what we've seen is consecutive quarters of fantastic recovery performance, that growth in output and orders. And I think what we're seeing now at the end of the year in the fourth quarter, and the main takeaway for this report is a slowdown in that growth. So the pace has come off, the foot's come off the accelerator somewhat. We're still seeing very positive figures, and especially if we compare that to our historic data, they're very positive in their own right. But in contrast to the roller coaster of experiences with the metrics we've had over the past year and indeed 2 years, we're starting to see a slowdown now. And now whether next quarter that translates into a continued slowdown or sustains throughout the year as manufacturers struggle with the challenges at the moment, whether that be input pricing, whether that being labor shortages, we would hope to see still continued positivity, however, not at the same pace that we've seen in the second and third quarter of this year.
One of the key points you're making in this report is that manufacturers are having to pay more for their inputs and as a result are having to raise their prices. What are the dangers here?
Well, there's been a sobering realization throughout industry that I think's occurred throughout the last quarter and indeed perhaps the one before that as well, which is that even at the start of the year and amongst COVID, there's been these price pressures mounting in industry. And I think it was largely thought at the start of the year that these price pressures would ebb as indeed the pandemic and globally the pandemic ebbs. This hasn't occurred. They've doubled down as the global economy and indeed the global manufacturing base gets back to work and restarts production at pace, which is putting an unprecedented strain on these already hampered supply chains. And it's now well accepted that we're going to have these price pressures and supply challenges well into 2022. Now, of course, there's a variety of subsectors that will be having their own unique challenges, and infamously, the semiconductor supply chain is very stressed at the moment. But as a result of this, manufacturers are now passing on their prices, whether down the supply chain with business to business or indeed down to customers at unprecedented rates. And this is now being widely accepted. So double-digit price rises of approximately, on average, about 10% are being happily accepted up and down the chain, as it's now the whole industry is prepared and ready internally for these prices to rise. Something interesting to note, however, is that while the ONS figures for producer price inflation, that's the metric which tracks the rate of input costs within the production industry, stands at approximately 13% for the latest month of October on the year. We're not really seeing that pressure filter through just yet into consumer inflation. Indeed, it's alarming that consumer inflation at the last figure, I believe, was approximately 4%. There's still a very large gap between the production inflation and consumer inflation. And what we're likely to see in the coming year is continued pressure on that consumer inflation as manufacturers and the production industry in general are still absorbing the majority of these costs. And it's not quite yet coming through in full force to the consumer.
There are a couple of issues here, aren't there? The fact that they've got to raise prices in the global market risks making them uncompetitive. And then, of course, there's consumer inflation and the pressures that's going to put on the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee, which meets in a few days' time, to consider interest rates. What's your prediction? Do you think they're going to put rates up?
I think, given this very recent news, and indeed as it's developing day on day, the severity with which both businesses and individuals are sort of taking this on board, I think it's increasingly unlikely.
You're referring to the Plan B rules just announced last week about Omicron and the fact that we're all going to have to work from home if we can, and the fact that businesses are going to have to retrench as a result.
Yes, exactly. And I think perhaps not just due to the announcement itself, but just the trajectory of the next month. Because of that, I think it's increasingly unlikely that the MC will decide to have any sort of, or be perceived to have a knee-jerk reaction for what is already a precarious recovery. I think they will hold off. I think it was argued that they'd perhaps hold off anyway, given they don't have a strong history of raising rates in December. I think it'll be seriously considered at their next meeting, and I think there'll be a bit of breath holding until then. But if I might just talk about that previous point about export prices, it's very interesting what we saw at the beginning of the year, which is exactly as you mentioned, for fear of international competitiveness. But following Brexit, what we saw is UK manufacturers not raising their prices at the rate that, for example, European partners were. And it was largely theorized at the time was exactly as you mentioned, to maintain as much competitiveness within the UK manufacturing base as possible. However, now I think seeing as these input pressures and these supply chain challenges not just being felt in the UK, they're being felt globally and certainly across the entirety of Europe. That competitiveness is now less of a concern because the price rises that are going on now within the UK manufacturing industry are happening all over Europe as well. And so as a result, the whole, so to speak, the tide is the water line is rising across all of the UK and Europe. So I think it's less of a concern now, but it's interesting that at the start of the year that was indeed exactly why manufacturers were being extra cautious, but following Brexit, didn't want to risk any decrease in competitiveness than perhaps had already happened with partners in the EU having to deal with new paperwork and export regulations and import regulations indeed.
Of course, if prices are rising universally in the global market, that will expose differences in productivity levels. But let's move on to employment. There are plenty of vacancies out there in the economy at the moment, but you don't see that as a positive for manufacturers, do you?
No, it's a curious phenomenon, and indeed the latest ONS data for vacancies within the manufacturing sector, which is approximately at 3.4 per 100 employed in the industry, is at the highest it's been in that time series, which goes back to approximately the 90s. And it typically never puts its head above the parapet of around 1.8 or 2. And what we see as well is in our own report, in this Q4 report, we see manufacturers' employment intentions are very high, but only being able to realize about half of what they intend to employ quarter on quarter. It's largely unsurprising that the demand is so high, given that order books are very strong and businesses are struggling to fulfill those orders, whether that be for raw material inputs or indeed labor inputs. What's more curious is in the wider economy is just where these workers have gone and how this has come to pass. I don't think any analyst or economist or indeed anyone would have thought last year, as we were moving out of the pandemic, that we'd be in a circumstance with the economy where there's just so many jobs available, and indeed at an all-time high. And that's something that we'll be watching closely, and how that evolves over the coming year, whether this is a strange blip as people have a proclivity to perhaps not work or take a break or early retirement, or whether it's more now built in things around a preference for jobs that offer remote working permanently, and which certain industries, such as the manufacturing industry, many roles are required. They're not viable if they're not in person. So we'll certainly be looking into that, and as to how systemic this change might be for the industry, and how long it'll take for this labour shortage gap to close.
Perhaps 2022 is shaping up to be a very interesting year for manufacturers. But I may mean that in the context of the old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. James, thanks very much indeed for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you for watching. This has been a special report from Manufacturing TV. I'm Nick Peters. Goodbye for now.